Hi, this is Sandra Brown with the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction and Public Pathology Education. I'm also the current president of the Association for Narcissistic Personality Disorder and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment. So this is a series that I've been doing trying to address and do a little theory correction. As somebody who wrote the earliest parts of the books that have turned into the narcissistic and psychopathic abuse field, and as the ones who did a lot of the development of trauma treatment for survivors, and also the research on what survivor traits are targeted by these pathological personality types. So I'm going to encourage you, if you're dropping in and this is your first video, this is video number 7 in a series. So you're going to need to go back to beginning at the intro and what I meant, and then each one of those describes the number one, the purpose, and then different topics that I've been dealing with. So there's one on no contact, and then there's one that it's not just about no contact, and one on it's probably not codependency. And then in the last one, we began talking about, what we found in our research with Purdue, and why we are saying that for over 60-some% of the survivors, it is likely not codependency in their behaviors and traits that is causing the targeting. And so in the last video, which was number 6, called Traits That Are Targeted, we began sharing this information. So it's all in the Women Who Love Psychopaths book, several chapters. In fact, about a third of this book is really goes into this discussion about this. And there's even a chart in there that compares codependency symptoms or behaviors with these super traits, these 2 personality traits that are elevated. And we began in the last video talking about the first personality trait that's elevated that we found, in our Purdue research. And that personality trait is called agreeableness. And each personality trait has all these facets that make up that trait that's almost like an umbrella of all these facets. And so you don't pick and choose. All of these facets make up agreeableness. And so what we found in the research was that survivors were over up into the high normal range in this trait. And you can listen in the other videos about why personality is important and why this look at personality as opposed to just environmental issues like early childhood abuse is important to differentiate, because not all survivors had early childhood abuse that's often connected to the issue of codependency. But what they do have is they all have a personality. And in 600 that were tested, these were the traits that were consistently elevated, which I think is just gives us a really good place to start in understanding for therapists and a place of treatment and in prevention. So all in the other video, go there. So in the last video, we started with the two facets that make up this trait of agreeableness. And the first trait in the high normal range was trust. And that means, of course, that you're trusting of others. You are also trustworthy. You tend to be optimistic about human nature, and you tend to see others through who you are. And in the last video, I talked about how that becomes problematic in a pathological relationship. And we talked about the difference between blind trust, which is what these survivors have, and conditional trust, which is what other people have that does not have this high normal range in the trait of agreeableness. So people that have a little less tend to have conditional trust, that people earn trust, and these survivors tend to have blind trust, and that's part of the problem that we talked about in targeting in the last video. The second facet that we also covered was straightforwardness, which means you are upfront, honest, and confiding. And we also talked about how that can get misused, by pathological people who, by their own personality hardwiring, are manipulative. So today, I'm going to try to not talk so much and get through the other 5 that are facets under this agreeableness. And I also want to remind you that there's a 3 or 3.5 hour free audio that I did on all the super traits on our website, saferelationshipsmagazine.com. It's on the home page on the right-hand side. It's called Super Traits of Personality and Why You Might Not Be Codependent. And so lots more information there, because I'm going to try to hit the high spots here. So listen to that. And of course, a lot of information here. All right. So next up, in the facets that make up agreeableness, we're not picking and choosing, is the trait called a giving nature. And that naturally, and it doesn't matter whether you were abused as a child, that might have created codependency, that even the survivors who did not have that experience still had this same facet in this trait elevation. And so you will have this whether you're codependent or whether you're not codependent, that you are simply super traded. But it's all about how I think how this gets misread. And I think that's, a really strong part of this book is how we challenged that issue about codependency and then create this chart. And I think it's really good, but I'm prejudiced. All right, so giving nature is that you are naturally, just by your own hardwiring, whether you were abused or not, altruistic. You tend to be very considerate and willing to compromise your interests for the sake of others, and sentimental. So what I think is interesting there is the part that talks about willing to compromise her interests for the sake of others. Because on the outside, people who don't understand this, therapists or family or friends, see that facet, that willing to compromise. And of course, they automatically think that's codependency. And if it's codependency, then codependency is generated out of this dysfunctional family, normally, or early aversive issues. And so this might not have anything to do with that. It's in the personality. It's not necessarily in the history. Let me say that again. It's in the personality, innate, hardwired, and the personality. It's not necessarily in the history. And that's true of all this. So we can see how that can get, misconstrued when people have mostly always associated behavior out of the nurture theory. Anything I read out there about the formation, for instance, of personality disorders or your behavior in these relationships, it's always nurture, nurture, nurture. Freud must love this. There's very little discussion about nature, which is how you come into the world, which is this, your personality. And personality is the most stable part of us. And it is the least thing that changes. That's why they call it innate. And we certainly understand that about the personality disorders, which is why, we continue to tell new survivors, and so do you, and you educate other people and tell other survivors in social media about that the personality isn't real flexible, and that part of the personality is very stable. And that's why we know what they're going to do the next time in the next relationship, and why we know there's very little change in that. And so in other people too, personality is innate. And so these factors are not dependent on the survivor's history. And I really want therapists out there to hear this, so that you can learn to differentiate that. And we're gonna, if you go over to our website, the association website at survivortreatment.com, put your name in, and we'll keep you updated on the training about this, where we really get into this issue about super traits and differentiation, with other diagnoses, including codependency, which isn't a diagnosis. Anyway, so we can see how this willing to compromise her interest for the sake of others, if you're very nurture-based, which is just a theory-based, which is just about everybody, survivors tend to quote that, therapists tend to quote that. This is a very different look at it. This is a nature look. This is very few therapists, work in, or have had, extensive training in like personality science, where their view of even relationship dynamics is seen differently. We see and think about things differently through the lens of personality, which is nature, which is the personality that you have and you're largely going to have the rest of your life. And so the super traits is a different view of the innate and natural personality that you came with. So that's the aspect of a giving nature. The next facet, which often is misread as well, is the facet of cooperation, and that you are prone to assisting rather than attacking, that you are motivated by social harmony in your relationships, which is why you will assist and not attack to get that social harmony. You are very reciprocal in relationships. You are helpful. You value getting along with others, which is why you will assist rather than attack. You avoid conflict. You are sociable. You are motivated by helping, sharing, donating, and volunteering. And so this trait of cooperation, again, I think is part of the codependency mislabeling, because they're assuming that all this cooperation is being generated out of a history. And that might be true for some that actually have that history, which is 30-some%. And on top of it, they likely have these super traits. But cooperation is not necessarily people-pleasing. In codependency, that people-pleasing is trying to get people to like you, and it's generated out of low self-esteem. And the super traits and all that in-depth research that we did on this, they did not test of having core self-esteem issues. So everybody has self-esteem issues in the middle of a pathological relationship and coming out of it. But the core of codependency is based in the issue of low self-esteem. And then all the behaviors of codependency come out of that issue of low self-esteem. And that's what Melody Beatty said in the first book on Codependent No More. And so that's sort of been the factor of that. But in super traits, with the people that, the survivors, especially those that did not have the early dysfunctional or aversive childhoods, did not have chronic low self-esteem. They had situational low self-esteem coming out of these pathological relationships. And a therapist might be seeing them, in that time capsule of trauma, and maybe seeing this facet of cooperation and seeing that situational low self-esteem from that, and make that assumption that it was generated from history instead of generated naturally, out of the personality. And we talk about that quite a bit in the book, in challenging this understanding about codependency. And so this trait of cooperation or facet of cooperation is one of those that's the most often misunderstood and misread. And so again, get the book and read that segment on codependency, because I don't know that we're going to have time to jump into that. The next facet is humbleness. You are modest in your portrayal of yourself, which means, unlike your partner who is very grandiose, you are not grandiose. You are gentle and well-tempered, warm, approachable, likable. So of course, what's not to love about you? What's not to come try to meet you? And being well-tempered, warm, approachable, and likable they just, you know, can slide right in. So what we hear survivors say a lot is that, of course, this is not at all how they how they see themselves right now. So you're coming out of these relationships with trauma, which is not gentle or well-tempered or warm or approachable. That's not at all how they feel, and they tend to forget like who they were, what they were like in their personality before that. And for people who do have long generational dysfunctional relationships or trauma, it may be really hard to know what your original hardwire and innate personality was like. And so, you know, coming out of this, they of course look traumatized, but it's again situational. And so after treatment, trauma treatment, and also working with these super traits, their personality, you know, reemerges. That doesn't mean there's not some dings on the personality from trauma, because we do know sometimes that changes some aspects of it. But, you know, we've seen most of our survivors, you know, snap back to, of course, their innate hardwired personality, which are these traits and facets. The next facet is empathy, which means you are tender-minded, kind, generous, compassionate, a peacemaker, and forgiving. And again, these, you don't pick and choose. These are interwoven, and the book goes into how this becomes part of the fabric of the relationship dynamics, and even part of the aftermath and why your development of cognitive dissonance is so much more severe than other types of victims. And so all of these facets, that's why I keep saying this is the whole theory base. Everything flows out of this. And if you don't have this, then you're a lot of the other stuff that you're reaching, grabbing for, and trying to build a theory off of doesn't make any sense. This is at the core of what contributes to the relationship dynamics and the aftermath, and how this has to be considered even in, you know, trauma treatment. So this issue of empathy, you know, I don't have enough time on this this video to go into that whole issue out there about narcissists and empaths and psychopaths and empaths, and I address it in the book. And so I did spend time out there looking at it, looking for some science on it, because we really want to use real science to help you and to understand this. And I'm not seeing, I'm seeing a lot of pop psychology stuff or energy stuff, or I don't know, they used to call it New Age, but I don't know what they call it now. Anyway, so, and there's a difference. So what I could see about the descriptions of what they call an empath is not exactly a match for this facet of empathy that's in the high normal range, which would mean it would be considered hyper empathy. And so how the 500 different ways that an empath is described out there, the best I could figure is that there is a difference between 500 different versions of being an empath and this one facet of empathy. And so the problem is, just like survivors are being shipped off, to CODA meetings for codependency they may or may not have, that 60-some% of them don't have, it is that the other part of that is survivors assuming that being an empath is a reason for their targeting or a reason for their difficulty and disengagement in the relationship. And so, again, I think the super traits are more science-based in that we do understand how these facets, contribute to it. But my concern is that if, a survivor thinks that that's the totality of the reason for targeting this one facet of empathy, they're not going to work on the other aspects, and they'll never learn how to really guard their personality when they're all focused on this empathy thing, and that they need to rein in their empathy, but they're not doing anything about their straightforwardness or their giving nature, or their cooperativeness, or their humbleness, or their trust. And we haven't even gone into the other trait of conscientiousness and all the facets that go there. They're just camped out on this one facet of empathy, as if that is the whole prevention program, if you will. And it's not. It is one facet in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, one of 8 facets in this trait. And all the other facets need chaperoning too. They need awareness, they need understanding, they need to know how it affects thinking, feeling, relating, behaving in these kinds of relationships, how they're active in targeting, all of that, not just this empathy. Please stop with this. It's all about this issue of empathy. And so I am glad that that's on your radar, that one aspect. But that's not the only thing that needs to be on your radar. So in the book, I do talk about, I address that the best I could with kind of the stuff that's out there that's very diverse, let's put it that way. And I also talk about the issue where survivors often wonder about being a highly sensitive person, which I guess is different. It is different than being an empath, and some empaths are that and some are that, but doesn't necessarily mean they're the same. And I talk about differentiating that highly sensitive person and the symptoms and behaviors associated with that in comparison to stuff that sounds very similar and a survivor can be experiencing in post-traumatic stress. So for me, the jury's still out on that. So, all right, back. So that was the facet of empathy. And we added the facet of loyalty, which means you have allegiance to others. You are have high levels of faithfulness, in that you are committed to obligations. And so we really see this facet, with some of the other facets in this agreeableness trait, active in the decision about ending the relationship. And you'll read it on social media where they, you know, they are very committed to these obligations, even to a pathological relationship. And it's not, you know, necessarily out of their history, it's out of their personality. So, you know, that made me, you know, sit up and take notice when my clients did not have that history and they did not meet the checklist for codependency. So that was off the table. But as they're trying to disengage in this relationship, this allegiance and this commitment to obligations was very profound. And they were not committed or allegiant because of financial necessity. So these were surgeons or whatever. They could just go buy another place. And it wasn't out of dependency. When I tested them for dependent personality disorder, they did not have that. They did not meet the checklist for codependency. And so what is it? And so, it, you know, in that personality is this loyalty factor that that people on the outside looking at it call it insane loyalty, because it doesn't, you know, make sense. You know, some survivors have talked about it from a trauma bond standpoint, but again, that's a whole other thing that maybe I'll get into, maybe I won't. And there's probably no pathological relationships that aren't trauma bonded, but this also looks at how personality plays into the strength and maybe even the proclivity to developing a trauma bond and the cognitive dissonance that goes along with it. So again, this is a different view when you're looking at it through personality science. I think it gives such a better and deeper and maybe more comprehensive understanding of how our personality is active in the whole relationship dynamics. It just makes more sense. And lastly, in that facet of agreeableness is the facet of tolerance, and which we added, and that they tend to be tolerant of differing opinions and behavior. And so this is another one of the traits that gets misread along with the issue of cooperation, is when people on the outside or therapists see this aspect of tolerance, and that looks like, of course, that it's related to codependency. And they are not being tolerant of differing opinions and behaviors because they're afraid to speak up, which is what is often associated with codependency. They are tolerant of differing opinions and behaviors because that's part of what this trait, this trait of agreeableness is. They are agreeable by nature. They are not agreeable by fear of people leaving them. So can that manifest into that in the middle of the relationship dynamics? Yes, situationally. That probably does happen, but at the core of them, they are tolerant because of this trait of agreeableness. And the interesting thing about this trait of agreeableness is that they also study these different trait elevations. And when you're high in this or low in this, what does it make you good at? or where is it problematic? And we're seeing where it's problematic in the hands of manipulators. But what these people are good at, they're excellent leaders. And so they're really good. These are the people that tend to get lots of promotions in their job, because this becomes part of their skill set, that they're straightforward and that they're reciprocal in relationships, and that they cooperate and they're humble and they're loyal and allegiant and committed to obligations, so they finish their projects, and they're tolerant of differing opinions and behaviors, like in the workplace. And so people that have high normal trait of agreeableness tend to be really good workers and leaders. And when I was Googling or researching and looking into other historical figures that fit into this high normal place in the spectrum of the agreeableness trait, up in the high normal part, the names that were mentioned were Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and I don't think we call them codependent. So these agreeableness traits are leadership traits, and we've named them the relationship investment traits because we're looking at it connected to these intimate partner relationships. But if we looked at it broader, it would be leadership traits, which is a type of relationship investment. But you know, what we've been talking about is this intimate, you know, relationship investment. So boy, did that just like snap me into a whole different viewpoint, which is why I ended up writing the chapter on codependency. When I read that this high normal agreeableness trait, you know, was associated with these people that changed the world, you know. And so these high normal agreeableness people are wonderful people. And I want to say again that this is a beautiful trait. I'm not saying there's one thing wrong with it. And that's what Purdue said, that in the hands of normal people, you are a blessing, you know, and look at that beautiful stuff that you bring. And so the only place it's problematic is when there are people with no conscience and low empathy that are looking for those beautiful traits that make you very approachable and trusting and empathetic and everything that we've just gone over. And so it's a beautiful, if you got to have something high normal, it's a beautiful thing to have. And it's probably reflected, you know, in your career success and your success with other relationships, school, people from school or college or girlfriends that you have kept for years and years, because you are the person that cares about the quality and the depth of the relationship. And it all generates out of this high normal agreeableness trait that is the relationship investment trait that makes you find great joy, great depth in relationships that work. And because you're relationship oriented and the high normal amounts of it, losing a relationship is even more painful to you. It's why you even have higher levels of cognitive dissonance, because you are the type that is wired for relationships. And so when that's like a core value for you in your personality, not just in your wants and dreams, but hardwired into your utter being, that you value relationships, and then you fail at those relationships, or the relationship ends, you don't fail, the relationship fails. It's extra painful to people who are wired for and come into the world made for relationships above all the other, traits, personality traits. It is this trait of agreeableness that really makes for the possibility of real depth and connection in relationships. And that's what you bring to it. But, you can't apply that to a pathological relationship. You can't make depth there. Everybody in a pathological relationship that relationship is going to fail. There is no way to live happily ever after with a narcissist or a psychopath. And so the loss of the relationship, ends up being really seen in parts of your traumatic reaction. So anyway, I don't want to go too long because then these videos get hard to upload. So that wraps up just the first personality trait of agreeableness. And we'll see how far we get on the trait of conscientiousness next time. I can't make any promises because sometimes I get long-winded, but we'll see. So go by our website, saferelationshipsmagazine.com. On the right-hand side is an audio called Super Traits of Personality. It's a 3 or 3.5 hour, they're 3 separate audios that make up 3 to 3.5 hours of lecture on this. So you can go much more deep there. And then in the book is a third of this is about it. So it really goes deep, and it, looks at issues of codependency and other diagnoses like borderline personality and bipolar and empaths and highly sensitive persons and all of that, and kind of compares and contrasts to how it fits or doesn't fit with the personality theory. So thanks for joining me. Bloggers, be professional, be kind, be citing sources. I'm happy that everybody joined us, and I will see you next time. And that's it. This has been Sandra Brown with the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. Thanks for joining me. Bye.